Book 2, Chapter 21 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Book 2, Chapter 21. The Night School and the Schoolmaster. Bartlemasses was one of a few scattered houses on the edge of a common, which was divided by the road to Treddleston. Adam reached it in a quarter of an hour after leaving the Hall Farm, and when he had his hand on the door-latch he could see, through the curtainless window, that there were 8 or 9 heads bending over the desks, lighted by thin dips. When he entered, a reading lesson was going forward, and Bartlemassie merely nodded, leaving him to take his place where he pleased. He had not come for the sake of a lesson tonight, and his mind was too full of personal matters, too full of the last 2 hours he had passed in Hetty's presence, for him to amuse himself with a book till school was over. So he sat down in a corner and looked on with an absent mind. It was a sort of scene which Adam had beheld almost weekly for years. He knew by heart every arabesque flourish in the framed specimen of Bartlemassie's handwriting which hung over the schoolmaster's head, by way of keeping a lofty ideal before the minds of his pupils. He knew the backs of all the books on the shelf running along the whitewashed wall above the pegs for the slates. He knew exactly how many grains were gone out of the ear of Indian corn that hung from one of the rafters. He had long ago exhausted the resources of his imagination in trying to think how the bunch of leathery seaweed had looked and grown in its native element. And, from the place where he sat, he could make nothing of the old map of England that hung against the opposite wall, for age had turned it of a fine yellow-brown, something like that of a well-seasoned meerschaum. The drama that was going on was almost as familiar as the scene. Nevertheless, habit had not made him indifferent to it, and even in his present self-absorbed mood, Adam felt a momentary stirring of the old fellow-feeling, as he looked at the roughed men painfully holding pen or pencil with their cramped hands, or humbly labouring through their reading lesson. The reading class, now seated on the form in front of the schoolmaster's desk, consisted of the 3 most backward pupils. Adam would have known it only by seeing Bartlemassie's face as he looked over his spectacles, which he had shifted to the ridge of his nose, not requiring them for present purposes. The face wore its mildest expression. The grizzled bushy eyebrows had taken their more acute angle of compassionate kindness, and the mouth, habitually compressed with a pout of the lower lip, was relaxed so as to be ready to speak a helpful word or syllable in a moment. This gentle expression was the more interesting because the schoolmaster's nose, an irregular aquiline twisted a little on one side, had rather a formidable character, and his brow, moreover, had that peculiar tension which always impresses one as a sign of a keen, impatient temperament. The blue veins stood out like cords under the transparent yellow skin, and this intimidating brow was softened by no tendency to baldness, for the grey, bristly hair, cut down to about an inch in length, stood round it in as close ranks as ever. "Nay, Bill, nay," Bartle was saying in a kind tone, as he nodded to Adam. "Begin that again, and then perhaps it'll come to you what D-R-Y spells. It's the same lesson you read last week, you know." Bill was a sturdy fellow, aged 24, an excellent stone sawyer, who could get as good wages as any man in the trade of his years. But he found a reading lesson in words of one syllable a harder matter to deal with than the hardest stone he had ever had to saw. The letters, he complained, were so uncommon alike there was no telling 'em one from another, the sawyer's business not being concerned with minute differences such as exist between a letter with its tail turned up and a letter with its tail turned down. But Bill had a firm determination that he would learn to read, founded chiefly on 2 reasons. First, that Tom Hayslope, his cousin, could read anything right off, whether it was print or writing, and Tom had sent him a letter from 20 miles off saying how he was prospering in the world, and had got an overlooker's place. Secondly, that Sam Phillips, who soared with him, had learned to read when he was turned 20, and what could be done by a little fellow like Sam Phillips, Bill considered, could be done by himself, seeing that he could pound Sam into wet clay if circumstances required it. So here he was, pointing his big finger towards 3 words at once, and turning his head on one side, that he might keep better hold with his eye of the one word which was to be discriminated out of the group. The amount of knowledge Bartle Massey must possess was something so dim and vast that Bill's imagination recoiled before it. He would hardly have ventured to deny that the schoolmaster might have something to do in bringing about the regular return of daylight and the changes in the weather. The man seated next to Bill was of a very different type. He was a Methodist brickmaker, who, after spending 30 years of his life in perfect satisfaction with his ignorance, had lately got religion, and along with it the desire to read the Bible. But with him too learning was a heavy business, and on his way out tonight he had offered as usual a special prayer for help, seeing that he had undertaken this hard task with a single eye to the nourishment of his soul, that he might have a greater abundance of texts and hymns wherewith to banish evil memories and the temptations of old habit, or in brief language the devil. For the brickmaker had been a notorious poacher, and was suspected, though there was no good evidence against him, of being the man who had shot a neighbouring gamekeeper in the leg. However that might be, it is certain that shortly after the accident referred to, which was coincident with the arrival of an awakening Methodist preacher at Treddleston, a great change had been observed in the brickmaker, and though he was still known in the neighbourhood by his old sobriquet of Brimstone, there was nothing he held in so much horror as any further transactions with that evil-smelling element. He was a broad-chested fellow, with a fervid temperament, which helped him better in imbibing religious ideas than in the dry process of acquiring the mere human knowledge of the alphabet. Indeed, he had been already a little shaken in his resolution by a brother Methodist, who assured him that the letter was a mere obstruction to the spirit, and expressed a fear that Brimstone was too eager for the knowledge that puffeth up. The third beginner was a much more promising pupil. He was a tall but thin and wiry man, nearly as old as Brimstone, with a very pale face and hands stained a deep blue. He was a dyer, who in the course of dipping homespun wool and old women's petticoats had got fired with the ambition to learn a great deal more about the strange secrets of colour. He had already a high reputation in the district for his dyes, and he was bent on discovering some method by which he could reduce the expense of crimsons and scarlets. The druggist at Treddleston had given him a notion that he might save himself a great deal of labour and expense if he could learn to read, and so he had begun to give his spare hours to the night school, resolving that this little chap should lose no time in coming to Mr. Massey's day school as soon as he was old enough. It was touching to see these 3 big men, with the marks of their hard labour about them, anxiously bending over the worn books, and painfully making out, "The grass is green, the sticks are dry, the corn is ripe." A very hard lesson to pass to after columns of single words, all alike except in the first letter. It was almost as if 3 rough animals were making humble efforts to learn how they might become human. And it touched the tenderest fibre in Bartle Massey's nature, for such full-grown children as these were the only pupils for whom he had no severe epithets and no impatient tones. He was not gifted with an imperturbable temper, and on music nights it was apparent that patience could never be an easy virtue to him. But this evening, as he glances over his spectacles at Bill Downes, the sawyer, who is turning his head on one side with a desperate sense of blackness before the letters D-R-Y, his eyes shed their mildest and most encouraging light. After the reading class, 2 youths between 16 and 19 came up with the imaginary bills of parcels which they had been writing out on their slates and were now required to calculate off-hand, a test which they stood with such imperfect success that Bartle Massey, whose eyes had been glaring at them ominously through his spectacles for some minutes, at length burst out in a bitter high-pitched tone, pausing between every sentence to rap the floor with a knobbed stick which rested between his legs. "Now you see you don't do this thing a bit better than you did a fortnight ago, and I'll tell you what's the reason. You want to learn accounts. That's well and good, But you think all you need do is learn accounts is to come to me and do sums for an hour or so 2 or 3 times a week. And no sooner do you get your caps on and turn out of doors again than you sweep the whole thing clean out of your mind. You go whistling about and take no more care what you're thinking of than if your heads were gutters for any rubbish to swill through that happen to be in the way. And if you get a good notion of them, it's pretty soon washed out again. You think knowledge is to be got cheap. You'll come and pay Bartle Massey 6pence a week, and he'll make you clever at figures without your taking any trouble. But knowledge isn't to be got with paying 6pence, let me tell you. If you're to know figures, you must turn 'em over in your heads and keep your thoughts fixed on 'em. There's nothing you can't turn into a sum, for there's nothing but what's got number in it, even a fool. You may say to yourselves, I'm one fool and Jack's another. If my fool's head weighed 4 pound and Jack's 3 pound 3 ounces and 3/4, how many pennyweights heavier would my head be than Jack's? A man that had got his head in learning figures would make some for himself and work 'em in his head. When he sat at his shoemaking, he'd count his stitches by 5s, and then put a price on his stitches, say half a farthing, and then see how much money he could get in an hour, and then ask himself how much money he'd get in a day at that rate, and then how much 10 workmen would get working 3 or 20 or 100 years at that rate, and all the while his needle would be going just as fast as if he left his head empty for the devil to dance in. But the long and the short of it is, I'll have nobody in my night school that doesn't strive to learn when he comes to learn as hard as if he was striving to get out of a dark hole into broad daylight. I'll send no man away because he's stupid. If Billy Taft, the idiot, wanted to learn anything, I'd not refuse to teach him. But I'll not throw away good knowledge on people who think they can get it by the 6-pennyworth, and carry it away with them as they would an ounce of snuff. So never come to me again if you can't show that you've been working with your own heads instead of thinking that you can pay for mine to work for you. That's the last word I've got to say to you. With this final sentence, Bartle Massey gave a sharper rap than ever with his knobbed stick, and the discomfited lads got up to go with a sulky look. The upper pupils had happily only their writing books to show in various stages of progress from pot-hooks to round text, and mere pen-strokes, however perverse, were less exasperating to Bartle than false arithmetic. He was a little more severe than usual on Jacob Story's Z's, of which poor Jacob had written a pageful, all with their tops turned the wrong way, with a puzzled sense that they were not right somehow. But he observed in apology that it was a letter you never wanted hardly, and he thought it had only been there to finish off the alphabet like, though ampersand, and would have done as well for what he could see. At last the pupils had all taken their hats and said their good nights, and Adam, knowing his old master's habits, rose and said, "Shall I put the candles out, Mr. Massey?" "Yes, my boy, yes, all but this which I am carrying to the house, and just lock the outer door now you're near it," said Bartle, getting his stick in the fitting angle to help him in descending from his stool. He was no sooner on the ground than it became obvious why the stick was necessary. The left leg was much shorter than the right. But the schoolmaster was so active with his lameness that it was hardly thought of as a misfortune, and if you had seen him make his way along the schoolroom floor and up the step into his kitchen, you would perhaps have understood why the naughty boys sometimes felt that his pace might be indefinitely quickened, and that he and his stick might overtake them even in their swiftest run. The moment he appeared at the kitchen door with the candle in his hand, a faint whimpering began in the chimney-corner, and a brown and tan-coloured bitch, of that wise-looking breed with short legs and long body, known to an unmechanical generation as turnspits, came creeping along the floor, wagging her tail, and hesitating at every other step, as if her affections were painfully divided between the hamper in the chimney-corner and the master, whom she could not leave without a greeting. "Well, Vixen, well then, how are the babbies?" said the schoolmaster, making haste towards the chimney-corner, and holding the candle over the low hamper, where 2 extremely blind puppies lifted up their heads towards the light from a nest of flannel and wool. Vixen could not even see her master look at them without painful excitements. She got into the hamper and got out again the next moment, and behaved with true feminine folly, though looking all the while as wise as a dwarf, with a large old-fashioned head and body on the most abbreviated legs. "Why, you've got a family, I see, Mr. Massey," said Adam, smiling, as he came into the kitchen. "How's that? I thought it was against the law here." "Law? What's the use of law when a man's once such a fool as to let a woman into his house?" said Bartle, turning away from the hamper with some bitterness. He always called Vixen a woman, and seemed to have lost all consciousness that he was using a figure of speech. "If I'd known Vixen was a woman, I never had held the boy from drowning her. But when I got her into my hand, I was forced to take her. And now you see what she's brought me to, the sly, hypocritical wench." Bartle spoke these last words in a rasping tone of reproach, and looked at Vixen, who poked down her head and turned up her eyes towards him with a keen sense of opprobrium. "And contrived to be brought to bed on a Sunday at church time. I wished again and again I'd been a bloody-minded man, that I could have strangled the mother and the brats with one cord." "I'm glad it was no worse a cause kept you from church," said Adam. "I was afraid you must be ill for the first time in your life. And I was particularly sorry not to have you at church yesterday." "Ah, my boy, I know why," said Bartle candidly, going up to Adam and raising his hand up to the shoulder that was almost on a level with his own head. "You've had a rough bit of road to get over since I saw you, a rough bit of road. But I'm in hopes there are better times coming for you. I've got some news to tell you. But I must get my supper first, for I'm hungry. Sit down, sit down." Bartle went into his little pantry, and brought out an excellent home-baked loaf, for it was his one extravagance in these dear times to eat bread once a day instead of oat-cake, and he justified it by observing that when a schoolmaster wanted was brains, and oat-cake ran too much to bone instead of brains. Then came a piece of cheese and a quart jug with a crown of foam upon it. He placed them all on the round deal table which stood against his large arm-chair in the chimney-corner, with Vixen's hamper on one side of it, and a window-shelf with a few books piled up on it on the other. The table was as clean as if Vixen had been an excellent housewife in a checkered apron. So was the quarry floor, and the old carved oaken press, table, and chairs, which in these days would be bought at a high price in aristocratic houses, though in that period of spider-lengths and inlaid cupids Bartle had got them for an old song, were as free from dust as things could be at the end of a summer's day. "Now then, my boy, draw up. We'll not talk about business till we've had our supper. No man can be wise on an empty stomach. But," said Bartle, rising from his chair again, "I must give Vixen her supper too, confound her, though she'll do nothing with it but nourish those unnecessary babbies. That's the way with these women. They've got no head-pieces to nourish, and so their food all runs either to fat or to brats." He brought out of the pantry a dish of scraps, which Vixen at once fixed her eyes on, and jumped out of her hamper to lick up with the utmost dispatch. "I've had my supper, Mr. Massey," said Adam, "so I'll look on while you eat yours. I've been at the Hall Farm, and they always have their supper betimes, you know. They don't keep your late hours." "I know little about their hours," said Bartle dryly, cutting his bread and not shrinking from the crust. "It's a house I seldom go into, though I'm fond of the boys, and Martin Poyser's a good fellow. There's too many women in the house for me. I hate the sound of women's voices. They're always either a buzz or a squeak. Mrs. Poyser keeps at the top of the talk like a fife. And as for the young lasses, I'd as soon look at water grubs. I know what they'll turn to. Stinging gnats. Here, take some ale, my boy. It's been drawn for you. "Nay, Mr. Massey," said Adam, who took his old friend's whim more seriously than usual tonight. "Don't be so hard on the creatures God has made to be companions for us. A working man would be badly off without a wife to see to the house and the victual, and make things clean and comfortable." "Nonsense! It's the silliest lie a sensible man like you ever believed, to say a woman makes a house comfortable. It's a story got up because the women are there, and something must be found for them to do. I tell you, there isn't a thing under the sun that needs to be done at all but what a man could do better than a woman, unless it's bearing children, and they do that in a poor makeshift way. It had better be left to the men. I tell you, a woman'll bake you a pie every week of her life, and never come to see that the hotter the oven the shorter the time. I tell you, a woman'll make your porridge every day for 20 years, and never think of measuring the proportion between the meal and the milk. A little more or less, she'll think, doesn't signify. The porridge will be awkward now and then. If it's wrong, it's summat in the meal, or it's summat in the milk, or it's summat in the water. Look at me. I make my own bread, and there's no difference between one batch and another from year's end to year's end. But if I got any other woman beside Vixen in the house, I must pray to the Lord every baking to give me patience if the bread turned out heavy. And as for cleanliness, my house is cleaner than any other house on the common, though the half of them swarm with women. Will Baker's lad comes to help me in a morning, and we get as much cleaning done in 1 hour without any fuss as a woman would get done in 3, and all the while be sending buckets of water after your ankles, and let the fender and the fire iron stand in the middle of the floor half the day for you to break your shins against them. Don't tell me about God having made such creatures to be companions for us. I don't say but he might make Eve to be a companion to Adam in paradise. There was no cooking to be spoilt there, and no other women to cackle with and make mischief, though you see what mischief she did as soon as she'd had an opportunity. But it's an impious, unscriptural opinion to say a woman's a blessing to a man now. You might as well say adders and wasps and foxes and wild beasts are a blessing, when they're only the evils that belong to this state of probation, which is lawful for a man to keep as clear of as he can in this life, hoping to get quit of 'em for ever in another. Bartle had become so excited and angry in the course of his invective that he had forgotten his supper, and only used the knife for the purpose of rapping the table with the haft. But towards the close the raps became so sharp and frequent, and his voice so quarrelsome, that Vixen felt it incumbent on her to jump out of the hamper and bark vaguely. "Quiet, Vixen!" snarled Bartle, turning round upon her. "You're like the rest of the women, always putting in your word before you know why." Vixen returned to her hamper again in humiliation, and her master continued his supper in a silence which Adam did not choose to interrupt. He knew the old man would be in a better humour when he'd had his supper and lighted his pipe. Adam was used to hear him talk in this way, but had never learned so much of Bartle's past life as to know whether his view of married comfort was founded on experience. On that point Bartle was mute, and it was even a secret where he had lived previous to the 20 years in which, happily for the peasants and artisans of this neighbourhood, he'd been settled among them as their only schoolmaster. If anything like a question was ventured on this subject, Bartle always replied, "Oh, I've seen many places. I've been a deal in the south," and the Loamshire men would as soon have thought of asking for a particular town or village in Africa as in the south. "Now then, my boy," said Bartle at last, when he had poured out his second mug of ale and lighted his pipe. "Now then, we'll have a little talk. But tell me first, have you heard any particular news to-day?" "No," said Adam, "not as I remember." "Ah, that'll keep it close. They'll keep it close, I dare say. But I found it out by chance, and it's news that may concern you, Adam, else I'm a man that don't know a superficial square foot from a solid." Here Bartle gave a series of fierce and rapid puffs, looking earnestly the while at Adam. Your impatient, loquacious man has never any notion of keeping his pipe alight by gentle, measured puffs. He is always letting it go nearly out, and then punishing it for that negligence. At last he said, "Satchel's got a paralytic stroke. I found it out from the lad they sent to Treddleston for the doctor before 7 o'clock this morning. He's a good way beyond 60, you know. It's much if he gets over it." "Well," said Adam, "I dare say there'd be more rejoicing than sorrow in the parish at his being laid up. He's been a selfish, tale-bearing, mischievous fellow. But after all, there's nobody he's done so much harm as to the old squire. Though it's the squire himself as is to blame, making a stupid fellow like that a sort of man-of-all work, just to save the expense of having a proper steward to look after the estate. And he's lost more by ill management of the woods, I'll be bound, than to pay for 2 stewards. If he's laid on the shelf, it's to be hoped he'll make way for a better man. But I don't see how it's like to make any difference to me." But I see it, said Bartle, "and others besides me. The captain's coming of age now, you know that as well as I do, and it's to be expected he'll have a little more voice in things. And I know, and you know too, what'd be the captain's wish about the woods if there was a fair opportunity for making a change. He said in plenty of people's hearing that he'd make you manager of the woods to-morrow if he'd the power. Why, Carroll, Mr. Ermine's butler, heard him say so to the parson not many days ago. Carroll looked in when we were smoking our pipes a Saturday night at Casson's, and he told us about it. And whenever anybody says a good word for you, the parson's ready to back it, that I'll answer for. It was pretty well talked over, I can tell you, at Casson's, and one and another had their fling at you. For if donkeys sets to work to sing, you're pretty sure what the tune'll be." "Why, did they talk it over before Mr. Burge?" said Adam, "or wasn't he there o' Saturday?" "Oh, he went away before Carroll came, and Casson, he's always for setting other folks right, you know, would have it Burge was the man to have the management of the woods. A substantial man, says he, with pretty near 60 years' experience of timber. It'd be all very well for Adam me to act under him, but it isn't to be supposed the squire'd appoint a young fellow like Adam when there's his elders and betters at hand." But I said, "That's a pretty notion of yours, Captain. Why, Burge is the man to buy timber. Would you put the woods into his hands and let him make his own bargains? I think you don't leave your customers to score their own drink, do you? And as for age, what's that's worth depends on the quality of the liquor. It's pretty well known who's the backbone of Jonathan Burge's business." "I thank you for your good word, Mr. Massey," said Adam. "But for all that, Casson was partly the right for once. There's not much likelihood like the old squire'd ever consent to employ me. I offended him about 2 years ago, and he's never forgiven me." "Why, how was that? You never told me about it," said Bartle. "Oh, it was a bit of nonsense. I made a frame for a screen for Miss Liddy. She's always making something with her worsted work, you know, and she gave me particular orders about this screen, and there was as much talking and measuring as if we'd been planning a house. However, it was a nice bit of work, and I liked doing it for her. But you know, these little friggling things take a deal of time. I only worked at it in over-hours, often late at night, and I had to go to Treddleston over and over again about little bits of brass nails and such gear, and I turned the little knobs on the legs and carved the open work after a pattern as nice as could be. And I was uncommon pleased with it when it was done. And when I took it home, Miss Liddy sent for me to bring it into her drawing-room, so she might give me directions about fastening on the work. Very fine needlework. Jacob and Rachel are kissing one another among the sheep like a picture. And the old squire was sitting there, for he mostly sits with her. Well, she was mighty pleased with the screen, and then she wanted to know what pay she was to give me. I didn't speak at random. You know it's not my way. I'd calculated pretty close, though I hadn't made out a bill, and I said £1.30. That was paying for the materials and paying me, but none too much, for my work. The old squire looked up at this and peered in his way at the screen and said, £1.13 for a gimcrack like that? Lydia, my dear, if you must spend money on these things, why don't you get them at Rossiter instead of paying double price for clumsy work here? Such things are not work for a carpenter like Adam. Give him a guinea and no more." Well, Miss Liddy, I reckon, believed what he told her, and she's not over fond of parting with the money herself. She's not a bad woman at bottom, but she's been brought up under his thumb. So she began fidgeting with her purse, and turned as red as a ribbon. But I made a bow and said, "No, thank you, madam. I'll make you a present of the screen, if you please. I've charged the regular price for my work, and I know it's done well. And I know, begging his honour's pardon, that you couldn't get such a screen at Rossiter under 2 guineas. I'm willing to give you my work. It's been done in my own time, and nobody's got anything to do with it but me. But if I'm paid, I can't take a smaller price than I'd asked, because that'd be like saying I'd asked more than was just. With your leave, madam, I'll bid you good morning." I made my bow and went out before she'd time to say any more, for she stood with the purse in her hand, looking almost foolish. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, and I spoke as polite as I could, but I can give in to no man if he wants to make it out as I'm trying to overreach him. And in the evening the footman brought me the £1.13 wrapped in paper. But since then I've seen pretty clear as the old squire can't abide me. That's likely enough. That's likely enough," said Bartle meditatively. "The only way to bring him round would be to show him what was for his own interest, and that the captain may do. That the captain may do." "Nay, I don't know," said Adam. "The squire's cute enough, but it takes something else besides cuteness to make folks see what be their interest in the long run. It takes some conscience and belief in right and wrong, I see that pretty clear. You'd hardly ever bring round the old squire to believe he'd gain as much in a straightforward way as by tricks and turns. And besides, I've not much mind to work under him. I don't want to quarrel with any gentleman, more particularly an old gentleman turned 80, and I know we couldn't agree long. If the captain was master of the estate, it'd be different. He's got a conscience and a will to do right, and I'd sooner work for him nor for any man living. Well, well, my boy, if good luck knocks at your door, don't you put your head out at window and tell it to be gone about its business. That's all. You must learn to deal with odd and even in life as well as in figures. I tell you now, as I told you 10 years ago when you pommelled young Mike Holdsworth for wanting to pass a bad shilling before you knew whether it was in jest or earnest, you're over-hasty and proud, and apt to set your teeth against folks that don't square to your notions. It's no harm for me to be a bit fiery and stiff-backed. I'm an old schoolmaster, and shall never want to get on to a higher perch. But where's the use of all the time I've spent in teaching you writing and mapping and mensuration, if you're not to get forrard in the world, and show folks there's some advantage to having a head on your shoulders instead of a turnip? Do you mean to go on turning up your nose at every opportunity, because it's got a bit of a smell about it that nobody finds out but yourself? It's as foolish as that notion of yours that a wife is to make a working man comfortable. Stuff and nonsense! Stuff and nonsense! Leave that to fools that never got beyond a sum in simple addition. Simple addition enough. Add one fool to another fool, and in 6 years' time 6 fools more. They're all of the same denomination, big and little's nothing to do with the sum. During this rather heated exhortation to coolness and discretion, the pipe had gone out, and Bartle gave the climax to his speech by striking a light furiously, after which he puffed with fierce resolution, fixing his eye still on Adam, who was trying not to laugh. "There's a good deal of sense in what you say, Mr. Massey," Adam began, as soon as he felt quite serious, "as there always is. But you'll give in that it's no business of mine to be building on chances that may never happen. What I've got to do is to work as well as I can with the tools and materials I've got in my hands. If a good chance comes to me, I'll think of what you've been saying. But till then I've got nothing to do but to trust in my own hands and my own headpiece. I'm turning over a little plan for Seth and me to go into the cabinet-making a bit by ourselves, and win an extra £1 or 2 in that way. But it's getting late now. It'll be pretty near 11 before I'm at home, and Mother may happen to lie awake. She's more fidgety nor usual now, so I'll bid you good night." "Well, well, we'll go to the gate with you. It's a fine night," said Bartle, taking up his stick. Vixen was at once on her legs, and without further words the three walked out into the starlight, by the side of Bartle's potato beds, to the little gate. "Come to the music of Friday night if you can, my boy," said the old man, as he closed the gate after Adam and leaned against it. "Aye, aye," said Adam, striding along towards the streak of pale road. He was the only object moving on the wide common. The 2 grey donkeys, just visible in front of the gorse-bushes, stood as still as limestone images, as still as the grey thatched roof of the mud cottage a little farther on. Bartle kept his eye on the moving figure till it passed into the darkness, while Vixen, in a state of divided affection, had twice run back to the house to bestow a parenthetic lick on her puppies. "Aye, aye," muttered the schoolmaster, as Adam disappeared. "There you go, stalking along. But you wouldn't have been what you are if you hadn't had a bit of old lame Bartle inside you. The strongest calf must have something to suck at. There's plenty of these big lumbering fellows that'd never have known their ABC if it hadn't been for Bartle Massey. Well, well, Vixen, you foolish wench, what is it? I must go in, must I? Aye, aye, I'm never to have a will of my own any more. And those pups, what do you think I'm to do with them when they're twice as big as you? For I'm pretty sure the father was that hulking bull-terrier of Will Baker's, wasn't he now, eh, you sly hussy?" Here Vixen tucked her tail between her legs and ran forward into the house. Subjects are sometimes broached which a well-bred female will ignore. "But where's the use of talking to a woman with babbies?" continued Bartle. "She's got no conscience. It's all run to milk." End of Book 2, Chapter 21. Recording by Simon Evers.
Chapter 22 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Ashworth. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 22. Going to the Birthday Feast. The 30th of July was come, and it was one of those half-dozen warm days which sometimes occur in the middle of a rainy English summer. No rain had fallen for the last 3 or 4 days, and the weather was perfect for that time of the year. There was less dust than usual on the dark green hedgerows and on the wild chamomile that starred the roadside, yet the grass was dry enough for the little children to roll on it, and there was no cloud but a long dash of light downy ripple high up in the far-off blue sky. Perfect weather for an outdoor July merrymaking, yet surely not the best time of year to be born in. Nature seems to make a hot pause just then. All the loveliest flowers are gone. The sweet time of early growth and vague hopes is past, and yet the time of harvest and ingathering is not come, and we tremble at the possible storms that may ruin the precious fruit in the moment of its ripeness. The woods are all one dark, monotonous green. The waggon loads of hay no longer creep along the lanes, scattering their sweet-smelling fragments on the blackberry branches. The pastures are often a little tanned, yet the corn has not got its last splendour of red and gold. The lambs and calves have lost all traces of their innocent frisky prettiness, and have become stupid young sheep and cows. But it is a time of leisure on the farm, that pause between hay and corn harvest, and so the farmers and labourers in Hayslope and Broxton thought the captain did well to come of age just then, when they could give their undivided minds to the flavour of the great cask of ale which had been brewed the autumn after the heir was born, and was to be tapped on his 21st birthday. The air had been merry with the ringing of church bells very early this morning, and every one had made haste to get through the needful work before 12, when it would be time to think of getting ready to go to the chase. The midday sun was streaming into Hetty's bedchamber, and there was no blind to temper the heat with which it fell on her head as she looked at herself in the old specked glass. Still, that was the only glass she had in which she could see her neck and arms, for the small hanging glass she had fetched out of the next room, the room that had been Dinah's, would show her nothing below her little chin, and that beautiful bit of neck where the roundness of her cheek melted into another roundness shadowed by dark, delicate curls. And to-day she thought more than usual about her neck and arms, for at the dance this evening she was not to wear any neckerchief, and she had been busy yesterday with her spotted pink and white frock, that she might make the sleeves either long or short at will. She was dressed now just as she was to be in the evening, with a tucker made of real lace which her aunt had lent her for this unparalleled occasion, but with no ornaments besides. She had even taken out her small round earrings which she wore every day. But there was something more to be done, apparently, before she put on her neckerchief and long sleeves, which she was to wear in the daytime, for now she unlocked the drawer that held her private treasures. It is more than a month since we saw her unlock that drawer before, and now it holds new treasures, so much more precious than the old ones that these are thrust into the corner. Hetty would not care to put the large coloured glass earrings into her ears now, for see, she has got a beautiful pair of gold and pearls and garnet lying snugly in a pretty little box lined with white satin. Oh, the delight of taking out that little box and looking at the earrings! Do not reason about it, my philosophical reader, and say that Hetty, being very pretty, must have known that it did not signify whether she had on any ornaments or not, and that, moreover, to look at earrings which she could not possibly wear out of her bedroom could hardly be a satisfaction, the essence of vanity being a reference to the impressions produced on others. You will never understand women's natures if you are so excessively rational. Try rather to divest yourself of all your rational prejudices, as much as if you were studying the psychology of a canary bird, and only watch the movements of this pretty round creature as she turns her head on one side with an unconscious smile at the earrings nestled in the little box. Ah, you think, it is for the sake of the person who has given them to her, and her thoughts are gone back now to the moment when they were put into her hands. No, else why should she have cared to have earrings rather than anything else? And I know that she had longed for earrings from among all the ornaments she could imagine. "Little, little ears," Arthur had said, pretending to pinch them one evening, as Hetty sat beside him on the grass without her hat. "I wish I had some pretty earrings," she said in a moment, almost before she knew what she was saying. The wish lay so close to her lips it would flutter past them at the slightest breath. And the next day, it was only last week, Arthur had ridden over to Rossiter on purpose to buy them. That little wish so naively uttered seemed to him the prettiest bit of childishness. He had never heard anything like it before, and he had wrapped the box up in a great many covers, that he might see Hetty unwrapping it with growing curiosity, till at last her eyes flashed back their new delight into his. No, she was not thinking most of the giver when she smiled at the earrings, for now she is taking them out of the box, not to press them to her lips, but to fasten them in her ears, only for one moment, to see how pretty they look as she peeps at them in the glass against the wall, with first one position of the head and then another, like a listening bird. It is impossible to be wise on the subject of earrings as one looks at her. What should those delicate pearls and crystals be made for, if not for such ears? One cannot even find fault with the tiny round hole which they leave when they are taken out. Perhaps water nixies, and such lovely things without souls, have these little round holes in their ears by nature, ready to hang jewels in. And Hetty must be one of them. It is too painful to think that she is a woman with a woman's destiny before her, a woman spinning in young ignorance a light web of folly and vain hopes, which may one day close round her and press upon her, a rancorous poison garment, changing all at once her fluttering trivial butterfly sensations into a life of deep human anguish. But she cannot keep in the earrings long, else she may make her uncle and aunt wait. She puts them quickly into the box again and shuts them up. Some day she will be able to wear any earrings she likes, and already she lives in an invisible world of brilliant costumes, shimmering gauze, soft satin and velvet, such as the lady's maid at the Chase has shown her in Miss Lydia's wardrobe. She feels the bracelets on her arms, and treads on a soft carpet in front of a tall mirror. But she has one thing in the drawer which she can venture to wear today, because she can hang it on the chain of dark brown berries which she has been used to wear on grand days, with a tiny flat scent bottle at the end of it tucked inside her frock. And she must put on her brown berries. Her neck would look so unfinished without it. Hetty was not quite as fond of the locket as of the earrings, though it was a handsome large locket with enamelled flowers at the back, and a beautiful gold border round the glass, which showed a light brown slightly waving lock forming a background for two little dark rings. She must keep it under her clothes, and no one would see it. But Hetty had another passion, only a little less strong than her love of finery, and that other passion made her like to wear the locket even hidden in her bosom. She would always have worn it if she had dared to encounter her aunt's questions about a ribbon round her neck. So now she slipped it on along her chain of dark brown berries, and snapped the chain round her neck. It was not a very long chain, only allowing the locket to hang a little way below the edge of her frock. And now she had nothing to do but to put on her long sleeves, her new white gauze neckerchief, and her straw hat trimmed with white today instead of the pink, which had become rather faded under the July sun. That hat made the drop of bitterness in Hetty's cup today, for it was not quite new. Everybody would see that it was a little tanned against the white ribbon, and Mary Bird, she felt sure, would have a new hat or bonnet on. She looked for consolation at her fine white cotton stockings. They really were very nice indeed, and she had given almost all her spare money for them. Hetty's dream of the future could not make her insensible to triumph in the present. To be sure, Captain Donnithorne loved her so that he would never care about looking at other people, but then those other people didn't know how he loved her, and she was not satisfied to appear shabby and insignificant in their eyes even for a short space. The whole party was assembled in the house-place when Hetty went down, all of course in their Sunday clothes, and the bells had been ringing so this morning in honour of the captain's 21st birthday, and the work had all been got done so early that Marty and Tommy were not quite easy in their minds until their mother had assured them that going to church was not part of the day's festivities. Mr. Poyser had once suggested that the house should be shut up and left to take care of itself. "For," said he, "there's no danger of anybody's breaking in, everybody'll be at the chase, thieves and all. If we lock the house up, all the men can go. It's a day they want to see twice in their lives." But Mrs. Poyser answered with great decision, "I never left the house to take care of itself since I was a missus, and I never will. There's been ill-looking tramps anew about the place this last week to carry off every ham and every spoon we'n got, and they all collogued together, them tramps, as it's a mercy they hanna come and poisoned the dogs and murdered us all in our beds afore we knowed, some Friday night when we'n got the money in the house to pay the men. And it's like enough the tramps know where we're going as well as we do ourselves, for if old Harry wants any work done, you may be sure he'll find the means." "Nonsense about murdering us in our beds," said Mr. Poyser. "I've got a gun in our room, hanna I? And thee'st got ears as 'ud find it out if a mouse was gnawing the bacon. However, if thee wouldstna be easy, Alick can stay at home i' the forepart of the day, and Tim can come back towards 5 o'clock, and let Alick have his turn. They may let Growler loose if anybody offers to do mischief, and there's Alick's dog too, ready enough to set his tooth in a tramp if Alick gives him a wink." Mrs. Poyser accepted this compromise, but thought it advisable to bar and bolt to the utmost. And now, at the last moment before starting, Nancy the dairymaid was closing the shutters of the house-place, although the window, lying under the immediate observation of Alick and the dogs, might have been supposed the least likely to be selected for a burglarious attempt. The covered cart without springs was standing ready to carry the whole family except the men servants. Mr. Poyser and the grandfather sat on the seat in front, and within there was room for all the women and children. The fuller the cart the better, because then the jolting would not hurt so much, and Nancy's broad person and thick arms were an excellent cushion to be pitched on. But Mr. Poyser drove at no more than a walking pace, that there might be as little risk of jolting as possible on this warm day, and there was time to exchange greetings and remarks with the foot passengers who were going the same way, specking the paths between the green meadows and the golden cornfields with bits of movable bright colour, a scarlet waistcoat to match the poppies that nodded a little too thickly among the corn, or a dark blue neckerchief with ends flaunting across a brand-new white smock frock. All Broxton and all Hayslope were to be at the chase, and make merry there in honour of the heir. And the old men and women, who had never been so far down this side of the hill for the last 20 years, were being brought from Broxton and Hayslope in one of the farmers' waggons, at Mr. Irwine's suggestion. The church bells had struck up again now, a last tune before the ringers came down the hill to have their share in the festival, and before the bells had finished, other music was heard approaching, so that even old Brown, the sober horse that was drawing Mr. Poyser's cart, began to prick up his ears. It was the band of the Benefit Club, which had mustered in all its glory, that is to say, in bright blue scarfs and blue favours, and carrying its banner with the motto, "Let brotherly love continue," encircling a picture of a stone pit. The carts, of course, were not to enter the chase. Every one must get down at the lodges, and the vehicles must be sent back. "Why, the chase is like a fair already," said Mrs. Poyser as she got down from the cart, and saw the group scattered under the great oaks, and the boys running about in the hot sunshine to survey the tall poles surmounted by the fluttering garments that were to be the prize of the successful climbers. "I should have thought there wasna so many people i' the two parishes. Mercy on us, how hot it is out of the shade! Come here, Totty, else your little face will be burnt to a scratchin'. They might ha' cooked the dinners i' that open space and saved the fires. I shall go to Mrs. Best's room and sit down." Stop a bit," said Mr. Poyser. "There's the waggon comin' with the old folks in it. It'll be such a sight as wonna come o'er again, to see 'em get down and walk along all together. You remember some on 'em in their prime, eh, father?" "Aye, aye," said old Martin, walking slowly under the shade of the lodge porch, from which he could see the aged party descend. I remember Jacob Taft walking 50 mile after the Scotch rebels, when they turned back from Stoniton. He felt himself quite a youngster, with a long life before him, as he saw the Hayslope patriarch, Allfather Taft, descend from the waggon and walk towards him, in his brown nightcap, and leaning on his 2 sticks. "Well, Mr. Taft," shouted old Martin at the utmost stretch of his voice, for though he knew the old man was stone deaf, he could not omit the propriety of a greeting. "You're hearty yet. You can enjoy your sen to-day for all your 90 and better." "Your sarvant, mesters, your sarvant," said Father Taft, in a treble tone, perceiving that he was in company. The aged group, under care of sons or daughters, themselves worn and grey, passed on along the least winding carriage road towards the house, where a special table was prepared for them, while the Poyser party wisely struck across the grass under the shade of the great trees, but not out of view of the house front, with its sloping lawn and flower beds, or of the pretty striped marquee at the edge of the lawn, standing at right angles, with 2 larger marquees on each side of the open green space where the games were to be played. The house would have been nothing but a plain square mansion of Queen Anne's time, but for the remnant of an old abbey to which it was united at one end, in much the same way as one may sometimes see a new farmhouse rising high and prim at the end of older and lower farm offices. The fine old remnant stood a little backward and under the shadow of tall beeches, but the sun was now on the taller and more advanced front, the blinds were all down, and the house seemed asleep in the hot midday. It made Hetty quite sad to look at it. Arthur must be somewhere in the back rooms with the grand company, where he could not possibly know that she was come, and she should not see him for a long, long while, not till after dinner, when they said he was to come up and make a speech. But Hetty was wrong in part of her conjecture. No grand company was come except the Irwins, for whom the carriage had been sent early, and Arthur was at that moment not in a back room, but walking with the rector into the broad stone cloisters of the old abbey, where the long tables were laid for all the cottage tenants and the farm servants. A very handsome young Briton he looked to-day, in high spirits and a bright blue frock-coat, the highest mode, his arm no longer in a sling. So open-looking and candid too, but candid people have their secrets, and secrets leave no lines in young faces. "Upon my word," he said, as they entered the cool cloisters, "I think the cottagers have the best of it. These cloisters make a delightful dining-room on a hot day. That was capital advice of yours, Irwin, about the dinners, to let them be as orderly and comfortable as possible, and only for the tenants, especially as I had only a limited sum after all. For though my grandfather talked of a carte blanche, he couldn't make up his mind to trust me when it came to the point." "Never mind. You'll give more pleasure in this quiet way," said Mr. Irwin. "In this sort of thing people are constantly confounding liberality with riot and disorder. It sounds very grand to say that so many sheep and oxen were roasted whole, and everybody ate who liked to come, but in the end it generally happens that no one has had an enjoyable meal. If the people get a good dinner and a moderate quantity of ale in the middle of the day, they'll be able to enjoy the games as the day cools. You can't hinder some of them from getting too much towards evening, but drunkenness and darkness go better together than drunkenness and daylight. Well, I hope there won't be much of it. I've kept the Treddleston people away by having a feast for them in the town, and I've got Casson and Adam Bede and some other good fellows to look to the giving out of ale in the booths, and to take care things don't go too far. Come, let us go up above now and see the dinner tables for the large tenants." They went up the stone staircase, leading simply to the long gallery above the cloisters, a gallery where all the dusty, worthless old pictures had been banished for the last 3 generations. Mouldy portraits of Queen Elizabeth and her ladies, General Monk with his eye knocked out, Daniel very much in the dark among the lions, and Julius Caesar on horseback with a high nose and laurel crown, holding his commentaries in his hand. "What a capital thing it is that they saved this piece of the old abbey," said Arthur. "If I'm ever master here, I shall do up the gallery in first-rate style. We've got no room in the house a third as large as this. That second table is for the farmers' wives and children. Mrs. Best said it would be more comfortable for the mothers and children to be by themselves. I was determined to have the children and make a regular family thing of it. I shall be the old squire to those little lads and lasses some day, and they'll tell their children what a much finer young fellow I was than my own son. There's a table for the women and children below as well. But you will see them all. You will come up with me after dinner, I hope." "Yes, to be sure," said Mr. Irwine. "I wouldn't miss your maiden speech to the tenantry." "And there will be something else you'll like to hear," said Arthur. "Let us go into the library, and I'll tell you all about it while my grandfather is in the drawing-room with the ladies. Something that will surprise you," he continued as they sat down. "My grandfather has come round after all." "What, about Adam?" "Yes, I should have ridden over to tell you about it, only I was so busy. You know I told you I had quite given up arguing the matter with him. I thought it was hopeless. But yesterday morning he asked me to come in here to him before I went out, and astonished me by saying that he had decided on all the new arrangements he should make in consequence of old Satchell being obliged to lay by work, and that he intended to employ Adam in superintending the woods at a salary of £1 a week and the use of a pony to be kept here. I believe the secret of it is, he saw from the first it would be a profitable plan, but he had some particular dislike of Adam to get over. And besides, the fact that I propose a thing is generally a reason with him for rejecting it. There's the most curious contradiction in my grandfather. I know he means to leave me all the money he has saved, and he is likely enough to have cut off poor Aunt Lydia, who has been a slave to him all her life, with only 500 a year, for the sake of giving me all the more. And yet I sometimes think he positively hates me because I'm his heir. I believe if I were to break my neck, he would feel it the greatest misfortune that could befall him, and yet it seems a pleasure to him to make my life a series of petty annoyances. Ah, my boy, it is not only woman's love, that is, unloving love, as old Aeschylus calls it. There's plenty of unloving love in the world of a masculine kind. But tell me about Adam. Has he accepted the post? I don't see that it can be much more profitable than his present work, though, to be sure, it will leave him a good deal of time on his own hands. Well, I felt some doubt about it when I spoke to him, and he seemed to hesitate at first. His objection was that he thought he should not be able to satisfy my grandfather, but I begged him as a personal favour to me not to let any reason prevent him from accepting the place, if he really liked the employment and would not be giving up anything that was more profitable to him. And he assured me he should like it of all things. It would be a great step forward for him in business, and it would enable him to do what he had long wished to do, to give up working for Burge. He says he shall have plenty of time to superintend a little business of his own, which he and Seth will carry on, and will perhaps be able to enlarge by degrees. So he has agreed at last, and I have arranged that he shall dine with the large tenants to-day, and I mean to announce the appointment to them, and ask them to drink Adam's health. It's a little drama I've got up in honour of my friend Adam. He's a fine fellow, and I like the opportunity of letting people know that I think so. A drama in which friend Arthur piques himself on having a pretty part to play, said Mr. Irwine, smiling. But when he saw Arthur colour, he went on relentingly, "My part, you know, is always that of the old fogey who sees nothing to admire in the young folks. I don't like to admit that I'm proud of my pupil when he does graceful things, but I must play the amiable old gentleman for once, and second your toast in honour of Adam. Has your grandfather yielded on the other point too, and agreed to have a respectable man as steward?" "Oh, no," said Arthur, rising from his chair with an air of impatience and walking along the room with his hands in his pockets. "He's got some project or other about letting the Chase farm and bargaining for a supply of milk and butter for the house, but I ask no questions about it. It makes me too angry. I believe he means to do all the business himself, and have nothing in the shape of a steward. It's amazing what energy he has, though." "Well, we'll go to the ladies now," said Mr. Irwine, rising too. "I want to tell my mother what a splendid throne you've prepared for her under the marquee." "Yes, and we must be going to luncheon too," said Arthur. "It must be 2 o'clock, for there is the gong beginning to sound for the tenants' dinners." End of chapter 22. Recording by Tony Ashworth.
Chapter 23 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 23. Dinner time. When Adam heard that he was to dine upstairs with the large tenants, he felt rather uncomfortable at the idea of being exalted in this way above his mother and Seth, who were to dine in the cloisters below. But Mr. Mills, the butler, assured him that Captain Donnithorne had given particular orders about it, and would be very angry if Adam was not there. Adam nodded and went up to Seth, who was standing a few yards off. "Seth, lad," he said, "the captain has sent to say I'm to dine upstairs. He wishes it particular, Mr. Mills says, so I suppose it'd be behaving ill for me not to go. But I don't like sitting up above thee and mother, as if I was better than my own flesh and blood. Thee't not take it unkind, I hope." "Nay, nay, lad," said Seth, "thy honour's our honour, and if thee get'st respect, thee'st won it by thy own deserts. The further I see thee above me the better, so long as thee feel'st like a brother to me. It's because of thy being appointed over the woods, and it's nothing but what's right. That's a place of trust, and thee't above a common workman now." "Ay," said Adam, "but nobody knows a word about it yet. I haven't given notice to Mr. Burge about leaving him, and I don't like to tell anybody else about it before he knows, for he'll be a good bit hurt, I doubt. People'll be wondering to see me there, and they'll like enough be guessing the reason and asking questions, for there's been so much talk up and down about my having the place this last 3 weeks. Well, thee canst say thee wast ordered to come without being told the reason, that's the truth, and mother'll be fine and joyful about it. Let's go and tell her." Adam was not the only guest invited to come upstairs on other grounds than the amount he contributed to the rent roll. There were other people in the 2 parishes who derived dignity from their functions rather than from their pocket, and of these Bartle Massey was one. His lame walk was rather slower than usual on this warm day, so Adam lingered behind when the bell rang for dinner, that he might walk up with his old friend, for he was a little too shy to join the Poyser party on this public occasion. Opportunities of getting to Hetty's side would be sure to turn up in the course of the day, and Adam contented himself with that, for he disliked any risk of being joked about Hetty. The big, outspoken, fearless man was very shy and diffident as to his love-making. "Well, Mr. Massey," said Adam, as Bartle came up, "I'm going to dine upstairs with you today. The captain sent me orders." "Ah," said Bartle, pausing, with one hand on his back, "then there's something in the wind. There's something in the wind. Have you heard anything about what the old squire means to do?" "Why, yes," said Adam. "I'll tell you what I know, because I believe you can keep a still tongue in your head if you like, and I hope you'll not let drop a word till it's common talk, for I've particular reasons against its being known. Trust to me, my boy, trust to me. I've got no wife to worm it out of me and then run out and cackle it in everybody's hearing. If you trust a man, let him be a bachelor. Let him be a bachelor. Well, then, it was so far settled yesterday that I'm to take the management of the woods. The captain sent for me to offer it me when I was seeing to the poles and things here, and I've agreed to it. But if anybody asks any questions upstairs, just you take no notice, and turn the talk to something else, and I'll be obliged to you. Now, let us go on, for we're pretty nigh the last, I think." "I know what to do, never fear," said Bartle, moving on. "The news will be good sauce to my dinner. Ay, ay, my boy, you'll get on. I'll back you for an eye at measuring, and a headpiece for figures, against any man in this country, and you've had good teaching. You've had good teaching." When they got upstairs, the question which Arthur had left unsettled, as to who was to be president and who vice, was still under discussion, so that Adam's entrance passed without remark. "It stands to sense," Mr. Casson was saying, "as old Mr. Poyser, as is the oldest man in the room, should sit at top of the table. I wasn't butler 15 year without learning the rights and the wrongs about dinner." "Nay, nay," said old Martin, "I'm gin up to my son. I'm no tenant now. Let my son take my place. The old folks ha' had their turn. They mun make way for the young uns." "I should ha' thought the biggest tenant had the best right, more nor the oldest," said Luke Britton, who was not fond of the critical Mr. Poyser. "There's Mester Holdsworth has more land nor anybody else on the state." "Well," said Mr. Poyser, "suppose we say the man with the foulest land shall sit at top, then, whoever gets th' honour, there'll be no envying on him." Here's Mr. Massey," said Mr. Craig, who, being a neutral in the dispute, had no interest but in conciliation. "The schoolmaster ought to be able to tell you what's right. Who's to sit at top of the table, Mr. Massey?" "Why, the broadest man," said Bartle, "and then he won't take up other folks' room, and the next broadest must sit at bottom." This happy mode of settling the dispute produced much laughter. A smaller joke would have sufficed, for that Mr. Casson, however, did not feel it compatible with his dignity and superior knowledge to join in the laugh, until it turned out that he was fixed on as the second broadest man. Martin Poyser the younger, as the broadest, was to be president, and Mr. Casson, as next broadest, was to be vice. Owing to this arrangement, Adam, being of course at the bottom of the table, fell under the immediate observation of Mr. Casson, who, too much occupied with the question of precedence, had not hitherto noticed his entrance. Mr. Casson, we have seen, considered Adam rather lifted up and peppery-like. He thought the gentry made more fuss about this young carpenter than was necessary. They made no fuss about Mr. Casson, although he had been an excellent butler for 15 years. "Well, Mr. Bede, you're one of them as mounts huppards apace," he said, when Adam sat down. "You've never dined here before, as I remember." "No, Mr. Casson," said Adam, in his strong voice that could be heard along the table. "I've never dined here before. But I come by Captain Donnithorne's wish, and I hope it's not disagreeable to anybody here." "Nay, nay," said several voices at once. "We're glad you're come. Who's got anything to say again it?" "And you'll sing us Over the Hills and Far Away after dinner, won't ye?" said Mr. Chown. "That's a song I'm uncommon fond on." "Pih," said Mr. Craig, "it's not to be named by side of the Scotch tunes. I've never cared about singing myself. I've had something better to do. A man that's got the names and the nature o' plants in his head isna likely to keep a hollow place to hold tunes in. But a second cousin of mine, a drovier, was a rare hand at remembering the Scotch tunes. He'd got nothing else to think on." "The Scotch tunes," said Bartle Massey contemptuously. "I've heard enough of the Scotch tunes to last me while I live. They're fit for nothing but to frighten the birds with. That's to say, the English birds. For the Scotch birds may sing Scotch for what I know. Give the lads a bagpipe instead of a rattle, and I'll answer for it the corn'll be safe." "Yes, there's folks as find pleasure in undervallying what they know little about," said Mr. Craig. "Why, the Scotch tunes are just like a scolding, nagging woman," Bartle went on, without deigning to notice Mr. Craig's remark. "They go on with the same thing over and over again, and never come to a reasonable end. Anybody'd think the Scotch tunes had always been asking a question of somebody as deaf as old Taft, and had never got an answer yet." Adam minded the less about sitting by Mr. Casson, because this position enabled him to see Hetty, who was not far off him at the next table. Hetty, however, had not even noticed his presence yet, for she was giving angry attention to Totty, who insisted on drawing up her feet onto the bench in antique fashion, and thereby threatened to make dusty marks on Hetty's pink and white frock. No sooner were the little fat legs pushed down than up they came again, for Totty's eyes were too busy in staring at the large dishes to see where the plum pudding was for her to retain any consciousness of her legs. Hetty got quite out of patience, and at last, with a frown and pout, and gathering tears, she said, "Oh, dear aunt, I wish you'd speak to Totty. She keeps putting her legs up so, and messing my frock." "What's the matter with the child? She can niver please you," said the mother. "Let her come by the side of me, then. I can put up with her." Adam was looking at Hetty, and saw the frown and pout, and the dark eyes, seeming to grow larger, with pettish, half-gathered tears. Quiet Mary Burge, who sat near enough to see that Hetty was cross, and that Adam's eyes were fixed on her, thought that so sensible a man as Adam must be reflecting on the small value of beauty in a woman whose temper was bad. Mary was a good girl, not given to indulge in evil feelings, but she said to herself that, since Hetty had a bad temper, it was better Adam should know it. And it was quite true that if Hetty had been plain, she would have looked very ugly and unamiable at that moment, and no one's moral judgment upon her would have been in the least beguiled. But really there was something quite charming in her pettishness. It looked so much more like innocent distress than ill humour, and the severe Adam felt no movement of disapprobation. He only felt a sort of amused pity, as if he had seen a kitten setting up its back, or a little bird with its feathers ruffled. He could not gather what was vexing her, but it was impossible to him to feel otherwise than that she was the prettiest thing in the world, and that, if he could have his way, nothing should ever vex her any more. And presently, when Totty was gone, she caught his eye, and her face broke into one of its brightest smiles as she nodded to him. It was a bit of flirtation. She knew Mary Burge was looking at them, but the smile was like wine to Adam. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 24. The Health Drinking. When the dinner was over and the first draughts from the great cask of birthday ale were brought up, room was made for the broad Mr. Poyser at the side of the table, and 2 chairs were placed at the head. It had been settled very definitely what Mr. Poyser was to do when the young squire should appear, and for the last 5 minutes he had been in a state of abstraction, with his eyes fixed on the dark picture opposite, and his hands busy with the loose cash and other articles in his breeches pockets. When the young squire entered, with Mr. Irwine by his side, every one stood up, and this moment of homage was very agreeable to Arthur. He liked to feel his own importance, and besides that, he cared a great deal for the goodwill of these people. He was fond of thinking that they had a hearty special regard for him. The pleasure he felt was in his face, as he said, "My grandfather and I hope all our friends here have enjoyed their dinner, and find my birthday ale good. Mr. Irwine and I are come to taste it with you, and I am sure we shall all like anything the better that the rector shares with us." All eyes were now turned on Mr. Poyser, who, with his hands still busy in his pockets, began with the deliberateness of a slow-striking clock. "Captain, my neighbours have put it upon me to speak for 'em to-day, for where folks think pretty much alike, one spokesman's as good as a score. And though we've mayhappen got contrary ways of thinking about a many things, one man lays down his land one way, and another, and I'll not take it upon me to speak to no man's farming, but my own. This I'll say, as we're all o' one mind about our young squire. We've pretty nigh all on us known you when you war a little un, and we've never known anything on you but what was good and honourable. You speak fair, and ye act fair, and we're joyful when we look forward to your being our landlord, for we believe you mean to do right by everybody, and'll make no man's bread bitter to him if you can help it. That's what I mean, and that's what we all mean, and when a man said what he means, he'd better stop, for the ale'll be none the better for stannin'. And I'll not say how we like the ale yet, for we couldna well taste it till we'd drunk your health in it. But the dinner was good, and if there's anybody hasna enjoyed it, it must be the fault of his own inside. And as for the rector's company, it's well known as that's welcome to all the parish, wherever he may be, and I hope, and we all hope, as he'll live to see us old folks, and our children grown to men and women, and your honour a family man. I've no more to say as concerns the present time, and so we'll drink our young squire's health 3 times 3. Hereupon a glorious shouting, a rapping, a jingling, a clattering, and a shouting, with plentiful da capo, pleasanter than a strain of sublimest music in the ears that receive such a tribute for the first time. Arthur had felt a twinge of conscience during Mr. Poyser's speech, but it was too feeble to nullify the pleasure he felt in being praised. Did he not deserve what was said of him, on the whole? If there was something in his conduct that Poyser wouldn't have liked if he had known it, why, no man's conduct will bear too close an inspection, and Poyser was not likely to know it. And after all, what had he done? Gone a little too far, perhaps, in flirtation, but another man in his place would have acted much worse, and no harm should come, for the next time he was alone with Hetty he would explain to her that she must not think seriously of him or of what had passed. it was necessary to Arthur, you perceive, to be satisfied with himself. Uncomfortable thoughts must be got rid of by good intentions for the future, which can be formed so rapidly that he had time to be uncomfortable and to become easy again before Mr. Poyser's slow speech was finished. And when it was time for him to speak, he was quite light-hearted. "I thank you all, my good friends and neighbours," Arthur said, "for the good opinion of me, and the kind feelings towards me which Mr. Poyser has been expressing on your behalf and on his own. And it will always be my heartiest wish to deserve them. In the course of things we may expect that, if I live, I shall one day or other be your landlord. Indeed, it is on the ground of that expectation that my grandfather has wished me to celebrate this day and to come among you now. And I look forward to this position, not merely as one of power and pleasure for myself, but as a means of benefiting my neighbours. It hardly becomes so young a man as I am to talk much about farming to you, who are most of you so much older, and are men of experience. Still, I have interested myself a good deal in such matters, and learned as much about them as my opportunities have allowed, and when the course of events shall place the estate in my hands, it will be my first desire to afford my tenants all the encouragement a landlord can give them, in improving their land and trying to bring about a better practice of husbandry. It will be my wish to be looked on by all my deserving tenants as their best friend, and nothing would make me so happy as to be able to respect every man on the estate, and to be respected by him in turn. It is not my place at present to enter into particulars. I only meet your good hopes concerning me by telling you that my own hopes correspond to them, that what you expect from me I desire to fulfil, and I'm quite of Mr. Poyser's opinion that when a man has said what he means he had better stop. But the pleasure I feel in having my own health drunk by you would not be perfect if we did not drink the health of my grandfather, who has filled the place of both parents to me. I will say no more until you've joined me in drinking his health on a day when he has wished me to appear among you as the future representative of his name and family." Perhaps there was no one present except Mr. Irwine who thoroughly understood and approved Arthur's graceful mode of proposing his grandfather's health. The farmers thought the young squire knew well enough that they hated the old squire, and Mrs. Poyser said, "He'd better not ha' stirred a kettle of sour broth." The bucolic mind does not readily apprehend the refinements of good taste, but the toast could not be rejected, and when it had been drunk, Arthur said, "I thank you, both for my grandfather and myself, and now there is one more thing I wish to tell you, that you may share my pleasure about it, as I hope and believe you will. I think there can be no man here who has not a respect, and some of you, I am sure, have a very high regard for my friend Adam Bede. It is well known to every one in this neighbourhood that there is no man whose word can be more depended on than his, that whatever he undertakes to do he does well, and is as careful for the interests of those who employ him as for his own. I am proud to say that I was very fond of Adam when I was a little boy, and I have never lost my old feeling for him. I think that shows that I know a good fellow when I find him. It has long been my wish that he should have the management of the woods on the estate, which happen to be very valuable, not only because I think so highly of his character, but because he has the knowledge and the skill which fit him for the place. And I'm happy to tell you that it is my grandfather's wish too, and it is now settled that Adam shall manage the woods, a change which I am sure will be very much for the advantage of the estate, and I hope you will by and by join me in drinking his health and in wishing him all the prosperity in life that he deserves. But there is a still older friend of mine than Adam Bede present, and I need not tell you that it is Mr. Irwine. I'm sure you will agree with me that we must drink to no other person's health until we have drunk his. I know you have all reason to love him, but no one of his parishioners has so much reason as I. Come, charge your glasses, and let us drink to our excellent rector 3 times 3. This toast was drunk with all the enthusiasm that was wanting to the last, and it certainly was the most picturesque moment in the scene when Mr. Irwine got up to speak, and all the faces in the room were turned towards him. The superior refinement of his face was much more striking than that of Arthur's when seen in comparison with the people round them. Arthur's was a much commoner British face, and the splendour of his new-fashioned clothes was more akin to the young farmer's taste in costume than Mr. Irwine's powder and the well-brushed but well-worn black, which seemed to be his chosen suit for great occasions, for he had the mysterious secret of never wearing a new-looking coat. "This is not the first time, by a great many," he said, that I have had to thank my parishioners for giving me tokens of their goodwill. But neighbourly kindness is among those things that are the more precious the older they get. Indeed, our pleasant meeting to-day is a proof that when what is good comes of age and is likely to live, there is reason for rejoicing. And the relation between us and as clergymen and parishioners came of age 2 years ago, for it is 23 years since I first came among you, and I see some tall, fine-looking young men here, as well as some blooming young women, that were far from looking as pleasantly at me when I christened them as I am happy to see them looking now. But I am sure you will not wonder when I say that among all those young men the one in whom I have the strongest interest is my friend Mr. Arthur Donnithorne, for whom you have just expressed your regard. I had the pleasure of being his tutor for several years, and have naturally had opportunities of knowing him intimately which cannot have occurred to anyone else who is present, and I have some pride as well as pleasure in assuring you that I share your high hopes concerning him, and your confidence in his possession of those qualities which will make him an excellent landlord when the time shall come for him to take that important position among you. We feel alike on most matters on which a man who's getting towards 50 can feel in common with a man of 21, and he has just been expressing a feeling which I share very heartily, and I would not willingly omit the opportunity of saying so. That feeling is his value and respect for Adam Bede. People in a high station are, of course, more thought of and talked about, and have their virtues more praised than those whose lives are passed in humble everyday work. But every sensible man knows how necessary that humble everyday work is, and how important it is to us that it should be done well. And I agree with my friend Mr. Arthur Donnithorne in feeling that when a man whose duty lies in that sort of work shows a character which would make him an example in any station, his merit should be acknowledged. He is one of those to whom honour is due, and his friends should delight to honour him. I know Adam Bede well. I know what he is as a workman, and what he has been as a son and brother, and I am saying the simplest truth when I say that I respect him as much as I respect any man living. But I am not speaking to you about a stranger. Some of you are his intimate friends, and I believe there is not one here who does not know enough of him to join heartily in drinking his health." As Mr. Irwine paused, Arthur jumped up, and filling his glass, said, "A bumper to Adam Bede, and may he live to have sons as faithful and clever as himself." No hearer, not even Bartle Massey, was so delighted with this toast as Mr. Poyser. Tough work as his first speech had been, he would have started up to make another if he had not known the extreme irregularity of such a course. As it was, he found an outlet for his feeling in drinking his ale unusually fast, and setting down his glass with a swing of his arm and a determined rap. If Jonathan Burge and a few others felt less comfortable on the occasion, they tried their best to look contented, and so the toast was drunk with a goodwill apparently unanimous. Adam was rather paler than usual when he got up to thank his friends. He was a good deal moved by this public tribute, very naturally, for he was in the presence of all his little world, and it was uniting to do him honour. But he felt no shyness about speaking, not being troubled with small vanity or lack of words. He looked neither awkward nor embarrassed, but stood in his usual firm, upright attitude, with his head thrown a little backward and his hands perfectly still, in that rough dignity which is peculiar to intelligent, honest, well-built workmen, who are never wondering what is their business in the world. "I'm quite taken by surprise," he said. "I didn't expect anything of this sort, for it's a good deal more than my wages. But I've the more reason to be grateful to you, Captain, and to you, Mr. Irwine, and to all my friends here who've drunk my health and wished me well. It'd be nonsense for me to be saying I don't at all deserve the opinion you have of me. That'd be poor thanks to you, to say that you've known me all these years and yet haven't sense enough to find out a great deal of the truth about me. You think if I undertake to do a bit of work I'll do it well, be my pay big or little, and that's true. I'd be ashamed to stand before you here if it wasna true. But it seems to me that's a man's plain duty, and nothing to be conceited about, and it's pretty clear to me as I've never done more than my duty. For let us do what we will, it's only making use of the spirit and the powers that have been given to us. And so this kindness of yours, I'm sure, is no debt you owe me, but a free gift, and as such I accept it, and am grateful. And as to this new employment I've taken in hand, I'll only say that I took it at Captain Donnithorne's desire, and that I'll try to fulfil his expectations. I'd wish for no better lot than to work under him, and to know that while I was getting my own bread I was taking care of his interests. For I believe he's one of those gentlemen as wishes to do the right thing, and to leave the world a bit better than he found it, which it's my belief every man may do, whether he's simple or gentle, whether he sets a good bit of work going and finds the money, or whether he does the work with his own hands. There's no occasion for me to say any more about what I feel towards him. I hope to show it, through the rest of my life, in my actions." There were various opinions about Adam's speech. Some of the women whispered that he didn't show himself thankful enough, and seemed to speak as proud as could be. But most of the men were of the opinion that nobody could speak more straightforward, and that Adam was as fine a chap as need be. While such observations were being buzzed about, mingled with wonderings as to what the old squire meant to do for a bailiff, and whether he was going to have a steward, the two gentlemen had risen, and were walking round to the table where the wives and children sat. There was none of the strong ale here, of course, but wine and dessert, sparkling gooseberry for the young ones, and some good sherry for the mothers. Mrs. Poyser was at the head of this table, and Totty was now seated in her lap, bending her small nose deep down into a wine-glass in search of the nuts floating there. "How do you do, Mrs. Poyser?" said Arthur. "Weren't you pleased to hear your husband make such a good speech to-day?" "Oh, sir, the men are mostly so tongue-tied, you're forced partly to guess what they mean, as you do with the dumb creatures." "What, you think you could have made it better for him?" said Mr. Irwine, laughing. "Well, sir, when I want to say anything, I can mostly find words to say it in, thank God. Not as I'm a-finding fault with my husband, for if he's a man of few words, what he says he'll stand to." "I'm sure I never saw a prettier party than this," Arthur said, looking round at the apple-cheeked children. "My aunt and the Miss Irwines will come up and see you presently. They were afraid of the noise of the toasts, but it would be a shame for them not to see you at table." He walked on, speaking to the mothers and patting the children, while Mr. Irwine satisfied himself with standing still and nodding at a distance, that no one's attention might be disturbed from the young squire, the hero of the day. Arthur did not venture to stop near Hetty, but merely bowed to her as he passed along the opposite side. The foolish child felt her heart swelling with discontent, for what woman was ever satisfied with apparent neglect, even when she knows it to be the mask of love? Hetty thought this was going to be the most miserable day she had had for a long while. A moment of chill daylight and reality came across her dream. Arthur, who had seemed so near to her only a few hours before, was separated from her, as the hero of a great procession is separated from a small outsider in a crowd. End of chapter 24.